Hello, everyone. I'm Aura Vasquez. Thank you so much for joining me today at another Aura's virtual town hall or VTH. I know that you have been pretty active with me for the past months, even a year, since I started these conversations to foster a better dialogue and also to bring us to take some action in some important topics that we are facing today. You know, we just went through elections day. We also have gone through a pandemic. So it's been quite exciting to be part of this process with all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the Instagrammers that are joining in. And thank you to all of you guys that are watching on Facebook. Now, I have a little bit of a predicament for folks that are watching on Facebook, because on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram, because unfortunately my guests couldn't join the live stream. So it's going to be kind of interesting for us to try and figure it out and try to have a conversation here. He is definitely on Instagram, but he is not anywhere else. So I'm trying to figure out how to get everyone coming through together. So I want to introduce my guest, but he's unfortunately not present on this stream, but he's on another stream. I wanna introduce you guys to Armando Gudinho, which is an incredible human being that I know. Let me see if I can maybe try. I'm trying all sorts of things, you all. I'm trying everything here. Okay. No, that's not gonna work. So I want you to join me to welcome Armando, but Armando is not physically here on YouTube and on Facebook and anywhere else, but he's definitely on Instagram. So if you guys wanna hop to Instagram, that'll be beautiful. It's Aura Vasquez Official. You can also do that there. But in the meantime, we're just gonna hear Armando and see him for you guys over here.
Are you sure you can't see me?
At all. Not at all. In fact, I'm going to turn it around so you can see what I see. This is what I see. Oh, okay. I think you're finally here. So all right. And Armando's here.
There you go. My apologies, Aura, to you. And
okay. Hold on. Time out. Let's time out for 1 second. And let's get the headsets together, because that's just going to drive us crazy.
What about now?
No, you still have feedback, but it's because it's me. Okay. All right, Armando, let's go. Let's do this, guys. Okay. We're here, we're doing it. Welcome, everyone. Here it is, Armando. Armando, join here. Armando, join over there. We are game, y'all. Amazing. So this is a conversation that I wanted to have for a really long time with Armando. Armando is somebody that is dear to my heart. I know him for many years. We share a very good friend that has transcended to the other side, I guess, and brought us together. So I couldn't be more excited and more happy to welcome Armando to this live stream, where he's gonna school us. Grab a pen and paper, because we're gonna learn tons of stuff about cannabis today. Welcome, Armando. How are you?
Well, you know what? I'm a little less stress-free, and I'm sure. Listen, to everybody who's tuning in, thank you, and my apologies. You know, usually I rely on my teenage children to help me through these things, and of course they abandoned ship about an hour ago. So, but I'm excited. I mean, there's lots and lots going on in the world of cannabis and marijuana policy.
I'm just so happy that you're here, dude. For a moment, I thought, oh my God, this might not happen. And this is such an important conversation for me personally, because as a Latina, pro-Latina, Colombiana, you know, born and raised immigrant, you know, I wasn't born in this country. For me, legalizing and decriminalizing cannabis has been something very deep in my heart, because me, myself, ended up in this country with my family in a lot of ways for the war on drugs. So how did you end up in this work?
You know, that's a good question. I mean, my very first time navigating this was actually around Proposition 215, when actually our mutual friend and colleague who's passed on first brought me in back then as a junior analyst, fresh out of college. I was excited, looking to meet the world, and I got my very first introduction into cannabis policy at the time when we were talking to local city officials about this then crazy idea, this radical initiative called Proposition 215 that sought to provide the first legal jurisdiction really anywhere for, in that case, medical marijuana. And, at the time, I think that was around the same time that I was like ending my run in experimenting, with cannabis. Like most young people, you start sometimes in the high school and go through college, and then most of us kind of wean out. And then I subsequently spent the last, the next 20 years and heavy the last 12 years, 10, 12 years working in this area. And of course, I stopped consuming cannabis years ago. So contrary to what many people think, we're not all a bunch of folks who are just interested in the herb.
Getting high. Absolutely, absolutely. So you were a huge force to make sure that Prop 64 passed. Some people know what Prop 64 is, some other of us don't. Just in a snippet shot, walk us back to what happened with Prop 64, what it is, what's the benefit now?
Yeah, well, Prop 64 is this landmark piece of legislation that, many folks played a big role in this, that legalize and establish commercial regulations or regulations for commercial consumption for adults 21 and older. It was actually the second real attempt here in California. The first attempt that we passed, or that we attempted to regulate cannabis, was back in 2010, an initiative that failed. Then, ironically, mostly at the hands of Latinos, because the Latino vote in a span of 1 month went from strongly supporting it to being against it, and that initiative lost in 2010. And then that gave us the opportunity to start building support among various communities of color, the most impacted communities, Black and brown communities. And by the time we got to 2016, this piece of legislation, which ended up becoming really at that time perhaps one of the most significant criminal justice pieces of legislation in the history of California, passed. And what it basically does is it provides legalization, regulation of a commercial cannabis industry for adults 21 and older. Other important provisions include no child under the age of 18 will go to prison now or go to jail for it. It provides a legal framework for taxation. And today we have roughly about 30 different types of licenses that are administered through 3 different agencies of the state government that attempt to regulate a $1 billion industry, which, by the way, by the end of this year, we will have reached $1 billion tax revenue, which is
incredible. That is incredible. And I just want to emphasize, so for those that are just joining in, welcome. I'm speaking to Armando Gudino, who works for the Drug Policy Alliance, and he is the manager here in California. He was a pretty strong force to legalize cannabis here in California. So if you have questions, please ask your questions in the comments. Instagram is already going on, they're on fire already going in here. But you guys also on Facebook and on Twitter, please welcome, and please also have your questions ready. So one thing that I wanted to ask you, or just wanted to emphasize, Armando, is that when I met you and I also became an advocate for legalization of cannabis, it was a pretty unique thing for a young Latina, to be speaking about this issue. For you too. We might be different generations, which makes it even more dynamic.
Did you just call me old?
No, that's not what I said. We're just in different generations.
Did you just call me old man on the interwebinet? Okay, that's fair. That's right. Accurate.
What I'm trying to say is that my parents will find it extremely controversial for me to advocate for cannabis and for you to advocate for cannabis, even though we're in different generations. So so how was that experience? I mean, I know that for me was kind of like evangelizing a group of people that has been marginalized and criminalized for the use of cannabis. So for me, I was like, guys, we need to wake up. This is actually a good thing for us. How was that process for you?
It was really the same, Aura. It's the one thing we know about the Latino community. I've oftentimes reminded people that sometimes being Latino is a way of life as much as it is an identity, and something that speaks to who we are. And in our community, issues like marijuana and drugs in general are very, very taboo. And I can tell you that when I first approached even my own parents, they looked at me twice, and I think they might have used an expletive followed by "you're crazy," and and that is something that we had to contend with. Look, I'll give you a perfect example. In 2010, when we first ran the then proposition, I think it was called 19, I want to say, in October of that year, we had Latinos overwhelmingly supporting legalization of cannabis that year in an initiative. And in a span of 30 days, roughly 1 month, and once the Catholic Church in particular expressed and started to express concern over this being a reality, that cannabis would be something readily accessible for our young people, they actually started campaigning. In a span of 30 days, we lost 10 percentage points and literally lost at the hands of the Latino community. And that had everything to do with the fact that Latinos were approached with, among others, scaremongering, fear tactics that sought to intimidate the community around the issue of cannabis corrupting our young people and our children, right? So, like many other cultures, there's taboo issues. Drugs is one of them, and that is something that has played a role in my life and yours and a lot of in the Latino community.
Well, so I think this is a really good segue for us to talk about legalizing and how is it really working for us. I mean, I stand by legalizing all illicit drugs. Personally, I think it will be it will be a huge change for the war on drugs, obviously for all the cartels and the violence that brings, the production of illicit drugs. But actually some people have expressed to me that they believe that when you legalize all drugs, actually more people are going to use drugs, So I guess that and to bring it back to cannabis, we legalize cannabis. What is it really working out for us? Is it more people now smoking pot or fumando marijuana, no sé? Or like talk to me about this post era of legalizing cannabis and the sense of the consumer. I also want to ask you in the sense of the policy and also
Sure.
the growers and such.
Look, I think first of all, let's put it in context, right? When we talk about cannabis law, cannabis policy, cannabis in California in particular, we already had a de facto pseudo legal structure through medical marijuana, which had been effectively approved back in 1996. So unlike other places in the country, we already had a system that unfortunately really wasn't regulated, much less well structured or implemented within the infrastructure of the California legal system. So I think that question might have been better posed back in 1996, what happened soon after we first legalized it. Now, 20 plus years later, cannabis not only had become part of the mainstream of California society, but in many regards, mainstream in the country and the world, in part because of what started here in California. Now, again, additional context, we took a product full circle to 2016 that started really in 2009. And we took a product that was an illicit substance that was illegal for the greater part of decade after decade after decade, that resulted in nothing but mass incarceration, predominantly of communities of color. And I think there's a couple of things that happened. One, I think society began to accept that, in fact, the war on drugs lied to us, that this wasn't as a disastrous, mind-altering, zombie-making drug that we were told many years ago. Two, that the idea that this particular type of policy of throwing people in jail was somehow going to address the concerns of those who advanced these type of draconian laws, drug laws, and therefore people began to see the transparency of it. All
Right.
you were doing was throwing people of color in jail. And many would go as far as to say this has been one of the most effective forms of socioeconomic and political control in the history of this country's political activities against its own residents and citizens. So I think after years of having this veil removed, the community began to see it for what it was, which was in reality a draconian drug law that was not doing any of what it intended to do. 40 years, Aura, 40 years since the Nixon administration went on TV and said, public enemy number one, drugs. And since then, over $1 trillion, millions upon millions of people incarcerated, some for petty drug crimes. And yet, since then, we've seen all indexes grow from the inception of the war on drugs. We're talking about everything from quantities, quality, volume, use. So it begs the question, I do these conversations a lot, and I always like to open up, especially at, depending on the crowd, I like to remind people that when you have $1 trillion spent, 40 years of a campaign that's failed, and the only thing it's done is to throw people in jail and not address the very issues that it claimed to set out to address, you have to ask yourself one of three things. One, how's this working out for us?
Exactly.
It's not, right? Number two, is there magic we can finally discover and use it to do away with drug use and drugs? Well, that only exists in my young daughter's fairy tales. Or three, do we start looking at what some would consider radical, even crazy ideas such as regulation and legalization? And that was really part of what we said with cannabis. Look, if we know that white, black, and Latinos are using and selling drugs at the same level, yet we see that there is a disproportionate over-policing of communities of color, and therefore results in the profiling, detention, subsequent arrests, prosecution, and incarceration of these young communities of color, when yet we know that use and sales are the same. That tells us that the law enforcement infrastructure of this country is incapable of applying this law in an equitable form. Therefore, we're going to set out to change it. And therefore, you will not send anybody to jail if, in fact, this is a legal, there's a legal system behind it. And that's, in fact, what we've done.
Right. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of defunding the police and investing in communities. So what would it be like if we have, I am more for an approach of making people do things safely. People are going to do them anyways, so can we make sure that people are safe, that also people are not treating issues that they have, personal, mental, emotional issues that they have with drugs. We do that with prescription drugs now, friends. Let me just tell you. I mean, some of the most dangerous drugs are prescribed by doctors. So I'm just going to leave it as that because I have some other questions for you. And the audience is on fire commenting about your stuff. And saying that, the police planted drugs in black and brown communities. So it's all that stuff. And I just want to, before I move on to more questions that I have for you, somebody asked me in an earlier post that I had to talk to you about how is this really translated, this legalization of cannabis, on communities of color. Sure. And especially, in LA, for example, and please help me understand this. You actually point this out to me today earlier, where, there's so many regulations in so many different places. Every city kind of has their own flavor of the law. So not everybody has an equity provision or social equity. So take us to what's happening in LA, since we're in LA, and talk to us post legalization. How is that working out for people of color from the standpoint of selling, growing, and being in the business, and also from the standpoint of, the policy wise and the consumer and such?
Well, when you first approached me about this conversation, we talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And let me start off with the ugly. We're going to go backwards, right? What's the ugly? We we legalized in California in 2016, Aura, and a couple of things happened. Um, the state, first of all, was ill prepared for it, right? I think many of us, and maybe at sometimes even folks like me who were in the trenches of this type of policy, um, we didn't know what was going to happen. We thought we knew, we expected certain things to happen, but I think, a lot of other push-pull factors played into it, including, the election of Trump. On the night that we were celebrating the victory of Proposition 64 while mourning the demise of democracy, maybe, there was one of the number one concerns was what's going to happen if Trump becomes somebody who is not going to support cannabis, right? We had just legalized. So I think that created a culture of fear among California legislators that to this day still resonates, in part because almost 70% of the state continues to be offline from any form of regulatory, any form of regulation for the commercial sale of cannabis. In other words, right? In other words, there's roughly 65% of counties and or cities where you go to and you cannot buy commercial cannabis, right? So that, I think, created, not I think, it did create, in fact, one of the biggest problems that we have in California. When you have 12% of the population, 40 million people, of which the majority say we want legal cannabis, and the cities and other jurisdictions in their majority say we're not prepared to let you have it, you end up with a very difficult situation that ultimately allows the illicit market to continue to thrive.
To grow. That is so dangerous.
That is extremely dangerous. So with that comes an undue burden on those who are good, responsible players trying to enter the market legitimately. And on the other hand, it also speaks to a degree of irresponsibility, maybe, on the part of those elected officials who don't want to or refuse to adhere to the will of the electorate and the constituent who said we want this. And in fact, some of them are plagued with continued fears and insecurities related to the federal government. Others Absolutely. Are, continue to promote these fear tactics that marijuana is going to destroy us. So you do have a very uneven implementation that continues to thrive 4 years later. That's the ugly. The bad part, right? The bad part is that within this
Wait,
mess,
hold on, Armando. That's the ugly part?
Yeah, no. Well, the bad is both bad and ugly, right? So we're going to actually compound those two.
Well, we're talking to Armando Gudino from the Drug Policy Alliance. So if you have any questions about what he's saying, please post them on the comments. Also, if you're on Instagram, you can go to the symbol, question mark symbol next to the comments and drop it there, because then I can see it and it doesn't get lost. For folks on Facebook and on Twitter, please, you can just ask away and I can pull the questions. So now we're going over the bad part. We just went over the ugly. Now we're going to go through the bad part.
And by the way, we could spend 2 hours on the ugly part. So, I'm just trying to find some of the more, to condense all of that. But on the bad part, here's some of the bad part. You mentioned social equity. When we first started to develop Prop 64, there was countless conversations dating back years. We're talking many years, double-digit years, around this important issue of how do we repair the damages? How do we repair the ill that the war on drugs has caused? And one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we did was that we didn't allow any kind of regulatory structure that we created in order to facilitate commercial sales to omit or prevent anybody with a previous conviction or drugs or something related in that field from entering the market. We didn't want to victimize people again, because we knew that over the years there was a disproportionate impact in communities of color, Black and brown folks, more men than women, were being thrown in jail, while others, including particularly whites, for the same crime, we're not even getting any time. So the last thing we wanted to do was to create a system where once we go legal, you can continue to omit people, certain communities. So, we started talking about social equity. And again, this is not something new to us individually. This was part of an ongoing effort on the part of many people across the country who said we need to repair the damages.
Right.
However, when you look at the previous description of the ugly and how government officials and others refused, in some cases, to follow the guidance and the direction that was being provided by the state in terms of a legalized infrastructure, when you have cities saying we're not going to put forward a commercial business program, and therefore not provide opportunities, that was the first problem. Second problem is we advocated strongly, programs that instituted a form of social equity, provide opportunities, whether it was by designating opportunities, greater opportunities to zip codes that had a disproportionately high amount of over-policing, to communities that have been persecuted and arrested and incarcerated at higher levels, opportunities for people to join that market. And unfortunately, a lot of that didn't happen the way that, for all intended purposes, we would have liked that. Many cities didn't develop social equity programs, and some of the cities that did develop social equity programs, unfortunately, as is in the case of Los Angeles, didn't do the best job that they could have, had a lot of faults, a lot of holes in its system. It perhaps could have used a lot more support from the general body of government, including Office of the Mayors and others. And you ended up with a failed system. It was
very messy, at least in Los Angeles. And I think it was very well intended. The idea that for every white person that was going to get a license, 2 or 3 of people of color that would have been great, but it doesn't. This is what I have heard is happening, where now they're partnering up with people of color, just using their. The other thing is that when the lottery happened, it was a lot of favoritism. And I read it in the LA Times where people that were waiting in line forever didn't get a chance. But then again, you see this corruption and this pay for play sort of thing and all these deals under the table. And it just doesn't help build trust.
And there's one other thing that at least in my office, we've been looking at from a more of a deeper dive into some of the challenges around this. When you think back to what I described in terms of how we took an illicit substance, turned it legal, attempted to regulate it, when we look at how businesses and industries really develop, we're talking years of development, progress, R&D, research and development, et cetera. And we took a product that already had an economic infrastructure within it, and we made it legal, but a lot of the business development side of it did not develop or develop too fast, too soon. I'll give you one example of what I'm talking about. Within days, if not weeks, or within months, if not days and weeks, we had an entire explosion of analysts, advisors, consultants, folks who just kind of came onto the scene. In fact, I'll share this story with you. In 2015, I was in a televised debate on cannabis. A year after legalization, I actually ran into this person, and he had now become a cannabis consultant for cannabis businesses, a person who just 3 years prior was actually publicly debating against legalization.
Incredible.
And to me, I remember saying to myself, and as we look at it today, you can throw a quarter into the middle of downtown and you're going to hit a dozen different people who are advising on a variety of different cannabis businesses, ventures, and other things. Along with that, you also have a lot of new associations. You have a lot of new trade groups. You have an entire industry,
new combinations of different communities they're forming too
onto the scene. So when even
the marketing around cannabis
everything
blows my mind how much has changed since legalization.
I remember going to a small conference around 2010, 2011 for cannabis, and there was a handful of booths, and there was a small space. And if you go to any of the major cannabis business expos today, and it parallels the giant conference convention events that car companies run. That's how much it's grown. Now, that created another set of problems for government. Why? Because
even the stock market, somebody's saying, got into.
Even the stock market, yes. We have well over 100, I believe it's well over 100 capital funds with over 10% of those at 100 million or more, if I remember correctly. But yeah, you know, we all of a sudden have a new legal framework for cannabis, for legal cannabis. We all of a sudden had 1,000,001 new consultants, trade associations. It literally exploded onto the scenes, and it left a lot of elected officials with insecurities. Insecurities of, who do I listen to? Who do I follow? I'm going to go to my regular, you know, in-house city attorney.
Who's my partner? Who's my trusted partner? My trusted
Let me go to the League of Cities. Let me go to the Association of Cities. Let me go to X. Let me go to Y. And you end up overwhelmed. I mean, I talk to elected officials. That's a lot of what I do. And, you know, you oftentimes literally heard it in their voice. There's like a sense of desperation. I don't know which way to go. And on top of that, some of my constituents who vote are saying that this is the ill of society, so I'm just going to stay out.
I mean, I remember talking to Jose Huizar, former council member in LA, and I mean, he was very against cannabis. And he took this very kind of conservative Latino approach of, it's bad for you, it's the gateway drug, is, you know, sadly, he helped shut down a bunch of businesses that were actually doing good things in his community. And he was not so great for his community himself.
As it turns out.
There it is, as it turns out. But I have a question related to what we're talking about here, which is that you mentioned that $1 trillion has been spent to criminalize our folks in the past 40 years. I cannot see the rest of the question, but I'm assuming it's around how much investments have been since legalization done in POC, people of color communities most affected by the criminalization of drugs.
You know, there is a significant push within our communities to advance and improve upon access, right? There is a great organization out there, someone that I've worked with before, and I think, you know, provide excellent resources, the Minority Cannabis Business Association. In fact, I just learned that their new chair is actually a local from here in the Southern California area, Jasmine Aguiar. Congratulations, Jasmine. You know, and I think organizations like that have made excellent strides in not only building the portfolio of the minority cannabis business industry, but also provide invaluable resources and information to help people get off the ground. And this is important note. This is very important because I think, as I was describing, when you have an industry that explodes onto the scene and all the ancillary services that come with it, from consultants to advisors, some of them nefarious, others not. Everybody's looking to make money off of an industry that is barely going to start growing. You do have a lot of room for mistakes. You do have a lot of room for people who take advantage. So it is important that you do seek out the advice of professionals and others like the Minority Cannabis Business Association, who are better equipped than, let's say, in the case of this guy I mentioned, or this cat I referenced, who just 3 years prior had been, you know, against marijuana, and all of a sudden there he was, advising businesses on it. Now, one could argue that if you spend all your life as a communist criticizing capitalists, you could become a good capitalist at the end. I certainly know folks who were like that, but you know, again, it speaks to the necessity of being able to do your homework. That's still part of the bad part we were talking about, right? The drug war became a drug war not only against people of color, but it became a drug war against the poor, and it's become a drug war against immigrants.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And this is something
true.
That even Prop 64 did very little to prevent people from, you know, having, certain consequences placed upon them as a result of petty drug crimes, particularly marijuana crimes. Look, this country was arresting, still pretty much is, 1.5 million people for petty drug law violations, of which the overwhelming majority, over 700,000 or 616,000, I believe was the actual number of people were being arrested for marijuana possession. That gives you an idea of just to the degree. Now, one of the good things is that today we do have 11 states that have fully legalized, including the District of Columbia, including 2 territories. And the juggernaut let loose in 2015, and today we're closer than ever before to reaching a point in which just about every state in the country will have reformed some degree of marijuana law or marijuana reform. But we're not quite there yet. At the federal level, we are making some good strides, a few successes there. We have a bill right now called the MORE Act that's being advanced by a coalition of reformers, including Drug Policy Alliance, who I work for. And the MORE Act would actually decriminalize and deschedule cannabis and create a 5% excise tax and that would allow states to establish their own marijuana laws. It's had some success. Go ahead.
Can you talk to us, go a little deeper there and talk to us and the difference, the distinction between legalization and decriminalization?
Sure.
I think folks, and I interchange those myself, so I'm guilty. But there is a lot of misconceptions about one and the other. And I see some folks are asking,
Sure. So, first of all, decriminalization is it's a set of policies that looks to prevent anybody from, it decriminalizes, it removes the criminal penalties from drug possession and drug use by individual amounts, for individuals by a certain amount considered personal use. In other words, nobody goes to jail for simply consuming for personal use or for obtaining or having on your body small amounts. Truth be told, many states, including California since the 70s, had decriminalized small possessions of marijuana. People were still being arrested. In the case of marijuana, which is the most consumed product of them all, that particular approach didn't work because what we saw was a lot of people still receiving citations, still being detained for it. And again, that led to mass incarceration. So, by legalizing it, you actually put the full force of the government's infrastructure, in particular its laws and public safety infrastructure, and allows it to be sold very similar in the case of California to alcohol. Like alcohol, you can consume in public. You cannot not consume while driving or operating machinery. Minors, it's a big no-no. You don't allow the random sale just to anybody in the case of cannabis. You put it in a organized, structured environment where it can be tested. Exactly.
As they say, regulated.
Right. So that is something that that we, set out to do by creating Prop 64. But again, we learned from Colorado and Oregon that went before us. Others have learned from us. One of the things that we set out to do, for example, in California, and that's also part of the bad for us, we wanted all criminal convictions related to marijuana to be expunged. And in doing so, remove the penalties that carry on people's records and that have lifelong implications. Years later, we now see that there could have been better ways that we could have addressed those problems. What we did was you could be able to go to the courts, submit a document, petition to have your record clean, and everything should be good. But that was not as readily accessible for communities of color, many of whom had to work, many of whom had traumatic experiences and weren't likely to go back to a courtroom environment to file your petitions, or whether it was just at the clerk desk, and have since then sought to have remedies for these issues and challenges. We've seen now other states who just are doing it automatically. In fact, the MORE Act at the federal level calls for a cleaning of marijuana records within a year's time, I believe, if and when it passes. So, this is policy, Aura. This is what we do. We try and identify areas of law, in the case of us in drug policy, that have a long-standing history the law either being misapplied or it just simply being a bad law, right? 3 strikes. The Just Say No campaigns of the 80s, the crack statute laws that went from, 100 to 1 to 10 to 1 to 9 to 1, et cetera, and so forth, right? These laws have wreaked havoc on our society, and this is what we're looking to mitigate through the work that we do at Drug Policy Alliance.
Beautiful. So some other questions that I see a lot of questions around, again, incarceration is much more costly than treatment, all these other things that happen around the illicit drugs or legalizing drugs or so, especially we're talking about cannabis. But can you touch briefly around how this is affecting the war against, the war in Mexico, the cartels, and how this is, I talk often about this because, again, this is very close to home. And oftentimes Colombia was, of course, one of the number 1 suppliers of crack cocaine in the world, but that wouldn't be happening if we didn't have enough demand. So there is a supply because the demand exists. The United States is the number 1 consumer of crack cocaine or cocaine in the world. So, there is that part. And I often say that in terms of international policy and international relations and foreign affairs, the United States have always taken the stand of, well, they're the problem. We don't have a problem. Right. They're the problem. Let's go and bomb their towns. Let's go and burn the jungles because they're full of coke leaves or such, and destabilizing a system in a whole other country that's causing for people to immigrate here. So you see how that whole thing works. I ended up here because we were experiencing that much violence around the world on drugs, and that's so sad to watch now happening in Mexico. The same kind of structure, the big cartels, now they're the smaller cartels, the same story repeating itself. Talk to us, please, shine the line on this issue around legalizing cannabis.
Yes.
And Mexico.
Yes. Look, the war on drugs is, as much as we reference it, or the drug war, has been the primary beneficiary of this policy at international and domestic level has in fact been government itself. And by government, I mean it's public safety machine, right? Mm-hmm. Law enforcement. When you look at, we spend $50 billion a year on fighting this war on drugs, or fighting this drug war. 25 billion from the local law enforcement jurisdictions, 25 from federal. And when you look at that combined, a lot of that is executed at the border level. And then you have an additional billions of dollars going out into Latin America, many countries that could be arguably considered, failed narco states even, where the money is being used in a militaristic fashion, right, to address a public health crisis. If somebody has a problem over-consuming drugs, they need help. They need medical assistance. Right. They need support. And this country, like many south of the border, have sought to address this problem with one thing: guns. And when you point guns at people with nefarious intentions, they oftentimes point guns back at you. Yeah. And this is what we've seen in Latin America. We've pumped billions of dollars into plans that sought to eradicate, mitigate, and arrest these drug lords, plans like Plan Mérida and others that span from the tip of Colombia,
carteles, toda esa cosa, yeah.
Northern California, border regions in Baja, and it's been an utter failure. It's been an utter failure. And in fact, in Mexico, what we learned in Latin America about the war on drugs is that the Americans sought to do what they did on the East Coast and in the Caribbean region. When the Miami area during the 80s was being flooded with cocaine in particular,
Scarface. Are you talking about Scarface?
no, we're talking about the cocaine cowboys. Yes, Scarface,
Right.
among others. No, they thought, well, we'll go down there, we'll chop the head off the snake, and things will mellow out. And to some degree, it actually worked. It worked up until they decided to go westbound into Mexico and other parts. And in Mexico, there was a whole new phenomenon that arose, something we now know as los cartelitos, right? The smaller cartels. You chop the head off the big cat, like El Chapo Guzman, and his massive empire and infrastructure, which was the largest at one point in Mexico, converts into three moderately sized, pretty formidable cartels that now the government has to contend not with one, but with three. On top of the other 8, you end up with more than 11. And quite frankly, if you add in all the other smaller transnational criminal organizations, we're looking at well over a dozen transnational criminal organizations that are operating under a variety of different schemes. Now, in Mexico, we are seeing a shift in trend right now that, quite frankly, is a little bit scary. And we're keeping an eye on it out of the LA office. And believe it or not, it's partially impacted by the COVID pandemic. A lot of the cartels over the last 10, 15 years had begun transitioning from being a transitional port where people bring drugs from other places and then moving forward to actually manufacturing and producing their own drugs. And a lot of these drugs, particularly methamphetamine and heroin, which are among the two, a lot of the precursors for those drugs were being brought in from China, methamphetamine in particular. So what we saw was that when COVID hit, and in particular China closed down a little bit before us and before Mexico, you saw the cartels start shifting their operations to increase production of one particular drug, now that marijuana is no longer their primary breadwinner. At one point, some cartels were making as much as 80% of their income was coming from marijuana sales. That is non-existent for many of them. In fact, it was more than 10 years ago that the cartel of the then El Chapo Guzman said that they would transition out of marijuana because they, like us in policy, look at the writing on the wall.
Wow.
And in Mexico, we saw an impact. And we saw an impact on the manufacturing of methamphetamines, and the price went up 6-fold, right? Now we are seeing a newly developing area of crime among the cartels in Mexico in particular, particularly out of the Guadalajara region, where we see an increase in the manufacturing and sale of illicit fake pharmaceutical drugs. In fact, a recent report by one of Mexico's federal task force indicated that in some regions along the border, 6 out of every 10 drugs, including heart pills, high blood pressure, and even the so-called male enhancement pills, 6 out of 10 are actually fake.
Wow.
And a lot of this is happening as a result of cartel sicarios going to these pharmacies and forcing these pharmacists to sell their fake drugs, which they began
I
to
saw some folks in the comments talking about, fentanyl. And
yes,
that's more like the opioid crisis. We're focusing more, siempre pa'lante, we're focusing more on cannabis right now. But there were some other comments about, that fake cannabis that they sell and how it has affected so much, folks with mental illness that live on the streets, like homeless folks.
Yeah, there's that's an interesting story. It's an interesting topic because I like oftentimes when I've heard people mention the issue of what they call fake cannabis, there is no real such a thing as fake cannabis. There's a synthetic product that's called cannabis.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's a synthetic product, right? And I try and dissuade that characterization because if by fake that means that it looks like cannabis, well, in reality, it's not. Cannabis is the flower itself, and or do we have untested cannabis? Do we have cannabis that has been tainted? Do we have cannabis that's weak, or even cannabis that's extremely potent? Yes to all of that.
Or less cannabis. Somebody says spice cannabis, less cannabis.
But when we talk about fake cannabis, that's a whole other area because that's actually a synthetic product that was created, invented, and meant to look that way. And by calling it fake cannabis, it gives it suggests literally, it outright suggests that this is in fact some type of cannabis when really it isn't. And somebody made a comment about the opioid crisis. Just very briefly on that, that continues to be a top priority in this country, and more recently here in California, and as recent as I think yesterday, in fact, there was a report released on the impact, the national impact on Latinos in cannabis, in opioids. Right. And DPA, who I work for, will be releasing next month an additional report that actually looks at the impact of opioids in California, and in particular on Latinos.
Please, when you have that report in your hands, you have to come back and share with us. So we want to know how that works, because I see some other folks in the comments asking if we know how many lives have been lost in Mexico and Colombia and Guatemala, and the whole trade until drugs, I guess, get here, because it's an unregulated international trade market.
Right. Millions of lives have been impacted. Hundreds of thousands have been lost. And unfortunately, to be honest with you, even as somebody who follows this and studies this and works in this field, I don't know that we really truly know. I mean, it's not uncommon that we find these, these large grave sites with multiple bodies, sometimes years later.
Se me fue el tiempo, and Instagram is telling me that we have 1 minute and 37 seconds. I guess we've been talking for an hour now. So what's next in 1 minute, and how can people become an advocate to your organization if they want to join?
Very quickly, the California Community Reinvestment Grants is probably one of the best and the good part of what we did with Prop 64. It's a special grant program that is developed so that people can apply in communities that were most impacted by the war on drugs. This fall, a new grant application is going to be coming out. Last year, there was 69 organizations across the state of California that were awarded, 25 in LA County. We're talking programs and grants to the tune of $300,000 to $700,000. That is something, the COVID-19, the created economic crisis, has renewed interest among elected officials to see that as an opportunity to gain revenue. So we're going to see a heightened movement to regulate more.
Beautiful. What's your website? How can people find you so they can be, join this discussion? We're going to have a discussion next Wednesday. You also mark your calendar. Next Wednesday at 6, we're going to have another conversation, and we're going to bring another guest. So that's going to be awesome. And how do we get in touch with you? We have 20 seconds. How can we get in touch with you and your organization if we want to be better advocates?
Drugpolicy.org. Myself, I'm at the drugpolicy.org California office. My email is there. You can reach me at agudino, AGUDINO, at drugpolicy.org.
Beautiful. Armando, thank you so much. We'll talk very soon, but I feel like I'm going to continue seeing you. There you go. I'm going to keep you here on Instagram for just a little while longer so we can say goodbye proper. But the Instagrammers, they say goodbye already to us. So, well, thank you so much for taking the time. Next week, we're going to have a guest and yourself. So that's going to be exciting. And we're going to have another interesting topic around the legalization of cannabis. And just what's the aftermath. So
yes.
Do you want to give us a little prompt about next week so we can get excited?
Next week, one of my colleagues, State Director Janet Sanipatin, will be joining you, myself, maybe one other person, to talk about the emerging industry that has a public health approach to addressing problematic drug use called harm reduction. Harm reduction is an area of study that looks to mitigate the direct and collateral consequences of drug use, problematic drug use, and the application of drug laws. And when you think about harm reduction, think about programs like, for example, syringe exchange, where you bring in good needles, we give you clean ones, we remove those from public and anybody potentially being harmed. And more importantly, it provides oftentimes the only point of contact for people who have extreme problematic drug use. So, harm reduction is an emerging area. It's becoming fast a priority in California. And more importantly, right now during COVID, we are seeing an increase in overdose. We are seeing an increase in consumption, overconsumption. And this provides an opportunity for people to start addressing some of this problematic drug use. But
Yeah,
more
and
importantly,
to start getting educated and seeing that there's no boogeyman under the bed, other than the fact that we don't want to see we don't want to see the writing on the wall.
well, and sometimes that boogeyman comes in the way of the federal government, which, by the way, an important note for anybody who's still with us on marijuana, and I'm sorry I didn't get to mention this for everybody, but last week there was a very significant move on the part of the federal government on an issue related to cannabis here in California.
Okay.
There was an actual lawsuit filed
Oh,
by
wow.
the Department of Justice and the DEA against some unnamed cannabis license holders in California, and the petition alleges that the Bureau of Cannabis Control is refusing to turn over information about these license holders.
I wonder, Armando, if we can piggyback on that, because I want the Instagrammers were actually asking about that. They were talking about some sort of lawsuit, and I think some of the folks here on Facebook too, that were saying, "Oh, there's some sort of this about." So I wonder if we can take this next week when we talk, maybe retake this conversation. And I want to thank you so much for just taking the time to educate all of us, and for everyone that joining in today. Also, thank you so much. So I will see you next Wednesday, 6
Thank
p.m.
you. Thanks for everything, and I'm sorry for the headache in the beginning.
No worries. Now we got it all handled. Next week is going to be smooth sailing, y'all. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
All right, friends. Thank you so much for joining us. Next week at 6 p.m., we will be here again. So please mark your calendar, have your questions ready, because Armando Gudino from the Drug Policy Alliance will be joining us as well. Thank you all so much, and I see you next week. Have a blessed Wednesday. Bye-bye.